way.
On top of this?
Yes, no?
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our discussion about prospects for productivity growth and policy implications for developing countries. I'm Ceyda Pazarbashoğlu, Vice President of Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions at the World Bank Group. I'm joined by three very distinguished panelists: Laura Alfaro from Harvard Business School, Nick Bloom from Stanford University, and Bob Gordon from Northwestern University. They're all very well-known scholars, and I will not get into the detail of their bios. And thank you very much for being with us today, Bob, Laura, and Nick. We have a large audience from across the world via Facebook, YouTube, World Bank Live. So please post your questions and we will get online and we will respond towards the end of the session. In mid-July, we published our new study, Global Productivity Trends, Drivers, and Policies. This was the culmination of 2 years of extensive work analysis of a team working together with the book's editor, Alistair Dieppe, in the Prospects group at the World Bank. And the starting point of the study is the decade-long broad-based productivity growth slowdown that predated the COVID-19 pandemic. And you see it very clearly in this chart that the slowdown continued to a longer running trend decline in advanced economies, where productivity growth is less than half of its 1980 to 2000 average. The slowdown relative to long run averages affected about 90% of advanced economies. In emerging market and developing economies, the global financial crisis partially reversed the surge in productivity growth. The slowdown in these economies is the largest and longest multi-year decline in productivity growth experienced over the past 4 decades. And if we look at the next slide, the gap in productivity levels between advanced economies and emerging and developing economies remains substantial. The differences between productivity levels are really striking, which is one of the issues we'll discuss today. Labor productivity in emerging and developing economies is just under 20% of that in advanced economies. In low-income countries, it is just 2% of the level in advanced economies. At recent growth rates, it will take over 100 years just to close half of the gap in average developing economy. So we started this crisis in a difficult place, with global labor productivity growth slowing from a peak of 2.7% in 2007, just before the global financial crisis, to a post-crisis throw of 1.5% in 2016, and it remained below 2% a year in 2017, 2018. And in emerging market and developing economies, the slowdown has reflected a host of reasons: weaker investment and efficiency gains, the reduction in sectoral reallocation, slowing improvements in key drivers of productivity, and a series of adverse shocks such as natural disasters, epidemics, wars, and financial crises. So in this study, we argue that COVID-19 will slow productivity growth further through multiple channels, and this includes lower investment, erosion of human capital because of increased unemployment and loss of schooling, and a retreat from global trade and supply chains. These channels operate against the backdrop of unprecedented policy uncertainty, record high global debt levels, and the likely increase in corporate bankruptcies around the world. So I'd like to ask each of you whether you agree with this assessment. I will start with Bob. You argued that new and recent technologies are unlikely to be as productivity enhancing as earlier 20th century inventions. Will COVID-19 lead to a further deceleration in innovation, or does it have the potential to be a game changer for the introduction of new productivity enhancing technologies? So should we be a bit more optimistic? Over to you, Bob.
Well, first of all, let me distinguish between the short run and what I might call the medium run out 2 or 3 years from now. In the very short run, in the United States, we've already seen that in the initial data, productivity has jumped upward not downward. And the reason for that was summed up by the team that Raj Chetty has assembled at Harvard to analyze the day-by-day evolution of the economy. And he characterizes this COVID episode as rich people stop buying things from poor people. Rich people, maybe the top half of the income distribution, who are retaining their jobs and their salaries in occupations where they can work from home, are seeing very little change in their contribution to GDP, but they're stopping their purchases of restaurant meals, hotel rooms, and other types of industries which employ relatively low wage workers. So we've had a shift in the composition of the economy from low wage to high wage in terms of the percentage of the labor force engaged in each area. So that's something to keep in mind. We're going to be seeing data for the next few quarters that are going to show productivity higher than it was before the pandemic began last March. Looking out more broadly, I think the area that I would focus on is human capital, not only the loss of knowledge by young people in their schooling, but something that's been a focus of one of my colleagues, and that is the pressure on women to drop out of the labor force because they are more needed now at home to take care of their children and to attend to and help their children in schooling. And so this is going to be a long run loss of human capital for women who are losing the work experience in this period when they're forced to stay at home with their children. So that's enough for me right at the beginning, but I would put those two aspects on the table. And I'd like to hear from the rest of you how you think the evolution in emerging market economies is going to differ.
Yeah, this is a major concern for us at the bank, the implication in terms of on women who are, as you said, working in services sector and who are much more subject to attending to housing needs at home. So it's really a major concern in terms of both the gains that we have had in bringing women to the labor force that may be reversed, but also the unequal impact on women. Nick, you talked a lot about in your work on uncertainty on investment and productivity. And if anything, with COVID, we have reached a new level of uncertainty, from health-related issues all the way to disruptions in production processes and many other. So what are your thoughts on, and we just talked about the service sector, which has been really can be entirely transformed if the recent changes in consumer behavior persist. So what are your thoughts on impact of uncertainty and what we are going through now? You need to unmute.
There you go. Thank you. I was about to say, you can certainly say uncertain. I was wondering why everyone was so expressionless. You can certainly say uncertainty is high. I actually spoke about this at Jackson Hole last week. And so I assembled a whole bunch of measures. And like every measure you have of uncertainties is at all-time highs, like consumers and firms and macro disagreement, etc. So then you're right. What would that do? I mean, there's a kind of macro effect, which is it just is retarding the recovery. So it's very hard for the economy to rebound, which requires a lot of investment and hiring until uncertainty falls back. If you're running a business, you're not going to go and hire lots of people and invest. So that's the, I think Bob's short run versus long run breakdown is great. Then in terms of the longer run, the things I'm worried about, I guess more from a firm side, are one, expenditure on R&D. So, and if you just go to the classic theory, it says when you're very uncertain as a firm, you don't want to do things that's hard to reverse because you discover you've made a mistake. And R&D expenditure is totally reversible. If I spend, hire a bunch of scientists for a year, I can't get the money back at the end of it. The same with training, probably IT investment. IT's been has a temporary jump up because everyone's moving home, but a lot of what I would call intangible investment has almost certainly slowed down. I actually think there's a big hit on universities. you know, like on Stanford campus, I know several of the labs were closed for months. Like one of my friends that is a very decorated scientist, she was telling me that she works with animals and, you know, they couldn't keep them. So they've lost all the animals. They're doing a, you know, genetic. So there's a lot of research that's been entirely paused because we can't access equipment. So I think one issue, unfortunately, is a big kick down in like R&D and intangible investment. The other thing you mentioned earlier in your report was globalization. So for this, my accent is kind of useful because I'm a British American. You know, unfortunately, in addition to COVID, there's obviously Brexit and populism in the US. There's you know, many other countries. I've seen it in Brazil and Mexico. There's various countries in which there's a pushback already against globalization. And he threw on top of that travel bans and immigration bans. I think that's a major threat because a lot of the growth over the last 50 years has come from, you know, spread of knowledge. The developed world, its product, your graph was great. The developed world, the product, you know, as Bob has pointed out, the productivity growth has been slowing down for a while. And we've been saved globally by the developing world has been catching up from a lot of catch-up productivity. And that catch-up, I think, will be held back if we can't trade. So I'll pass to Laura. Oh, sorry, I should pass back to you, Jayla.
No, good to pass to Laura because I was going to ask. She has been working a lot on FDI and the importance of FDI in growth, especially for emerging markets and developing economies. But now there are a lot of concerns about pandemic disrupting global supply chains. And so how will that have an impact? Would be great to hear from you, Laura.
Thanks to the organizers. So yes, following up a little bit on what Nick said, that there has been this view among policymakers and also business people that FDI can have benefits beyond the capital it brings and the jobs. So there is this view that countries can jumpstart their development because FDI gives them access to new technologies, new goods, new markets, know-how. There's a lot of learning by watching or learning by doing, and then the turnover of workers helps spread this knowledge, and also access to goods and backwards and forward linkages, an idea that goes back to Hirschman. And in this context of new products, technologies, and linkages, that global value chains have been very important. In fact, the World Bank's report last year was on global value chains. But as we know, even before the pandemic, firms were reassessing their linkages to other countries because of hyper specialization, but also trade wars. So because of the political environment, many firms have been thinking about reshoring or getting out of China at the very least. With the pandemic, this trend is likely to increase. One is a little bit the blame game, so countries blaming each other for the pandemic. So there's this example in China that they were blaming salmon, of all things, for the new spread of the virus in China, with retaliation to Chile and Norway. And we know that possibility of coming from salmon was very low. National security, and this has spread to everything, medical devices, ventilator, masks, and we see what's going on with vaccines. There is a race for vaccines and trying to produce your own and secure production. Also, a lot of the packages, stimulus packages, have tried to increase local production. Japan had a very particular clause of reshoring or getting out of China. And also in work that I have been doing with David Chor and Maggie Chen, we have found that it's also very popular. If you ask people, would you be willing to see a home production for medical devices? Overwhelming people say yes. So this is a concern, and we see worst case scenarios, everyone reshoring, worst case scenarios for developing countries if everything goes north. Having said that, it's very expensive. A world where everything gets reshored in the north is very expensive, and that is going to have effects on consumption and growth. Another one is you're asked to choose. You're either part of, let's say, a China global value chain or a US global value chain, and again, with political implications. Having said that, if what we see is firms trying to diversify suppliers, there are countries that can gain if they can set themselves in this new diversified global value chain. An example is Intel in Costa Rica. So Intel closed the manufacturing plant that they had in Costa Rica, and they kept only R&D. Manufacturing went to Vietnam. In the pandemic world, they're actually trying to bring back some of that production back to realize that the cost benefit of specialization versus cheaper, a little bit more expensive, they had done the wrong calculation. So again, countries that do their homework and focus, and again, do their investment, Wi-Fi, infrastructure, so on and so forth, may gain from this trying to find diversify suppliers. Having said that, as Nick said, the world is very politicized, and that is going to affect trade.
So in terms of, I mean, you all mentioned some of the key implications of COVID, but and if we look at, as Bob said, in terms of a longer term outlook for productivity growth and convergence, because for us at the bank, this is a key issue that we have been looking at, both in terms of what developing emerging market and developing economies can do, and what are possible lessons from advanced economies. And of course, in this world, as Bob mentioned, what advanced economies do will have major implications on emerging market countries. So perhaps looking at it from this perspective, Nick, firms, particularly those that require social interaction to generate revenues, face an unprecedented challenge and possible failure of their business model. So what does that mean in terms of firm and sectoral selection and reallocation effects that may occur over the long term?
Gina, thanks. So I'll give you a kind of a numeric answer, which is for the last, in fact, spurred on by Brexit, I've been part of a group at Nottingham University and the Bank of England running this thing called the Decision Maker Panel. So it's a survey of around 3,000 firms a month in the UK. We happen to be like perfectly in place to obviously pick up COVID when it came along. So we have very detailed data on these firms, outputs, expectations, also their accounts data. And in that, we can estimate the impact on TFP at the aggregate level from this kind of micro up. So interestingly, there are two components. So overall, we estimate that TFP is going to be about 5 to 6% lower because of COVID by mid next year. And there's two components that are offsetting. So one is called the within firm. So each firm is becoming significantly less productive. Why is that? Because the output is far down. So you see, I mean, think of a restaurant, they can only use half the premises. They just can't, they have massive capacity constraints. We have to use masks, temperature checks. There's all kinds of complaints about, the time wasting that's going on from this. It's obviously important, don't get me wrong, but it's reducing output. So on average, firms, total factor productivity as output relative to labor and capital is down about 10% within each firm. There's then weirdly a positive between firms and sectors component. And it comes back to something that's very intuitive. If, as Bob said at the beginning, like rich people have stopped buying from poor people. If you look at sectors that are hit worse, they tend to be ones that are classically low output per person. So they're like accommodation, entertainment, travel. So those sectors that are lower productivity have fared far worse than things like financial services and manufacturing. And then within each sector, there's also the case that lower productivity firms have done less well than higher productivity firms. So the basic numbers we see kind of medium run, I guess, mid next year, once the furloughing's over, is productivity's, there's a within -10, there's a between about +5. And so you're about -5 in productivity. Labor productivity is a bit lower because capital inputs have fallen far less than labor inputs. But, -5%, by the way, is an enormous number. So we're discussing briefly, we used to get very animated about -0.5% or +0.5%. -5% is a huge hit. It's like 2-3 years of productivity, or 3-4 years in the currently of productivity growth wiped out by this.
So we will discuss this a bit more, but just to follow up on this, Nick, because we get a lot of questions from policymakers that we work with. What should be the response in terms of supporting different firms, supporting different sectors, and so on? So if I could ask you on that, and then perhaps go to Bob and Laura as well on this issue of, when there's so much uncertainty as to what is going to be the consumer preferences going forward and the outlook for different sectors, different firms. You saw this in the discussion in Europe as well, as they are putting together the stimulus package. So it would be great to hear from each of you as to what should be issues that policymakers need to think through as they deal with this very uncertain period of decline in productivity, shifts in consumer preferences, potentially also leverage is increasing, debts are increasing, insolvencies will be. So it's a very difficult time to make good choices. So it would be great to hear from each of you.
If I can start, I would first of all remind everyone that the shift in consumption away from hospitality, travel, and to some extent some forms of retail is not driven by a lack of income, at least in a number of the developed countries, most particularly the United States. We've had a huge increase in our saving rate. Our total income, total personal income in the United States in every month of the pandemic has been higher than it was in February before the pandemic started. And this is because of massive government transfer payments. So if you ask, what can government do? The first thing is something that's already done. It's shown that consumption can be maintained at a high level, but very distorted level, because we've had balancing off the decline in hotels and travel and some forms of retail. We've had enormous growth in other types of retail as people try to spend all the saving on home improvement projects. Companies like Home Depot are experiencing record-breaking sales. So it's not that like the whole economy is sick and depressed. And you ask, what can policymakers do? This really changes the topic to the whole issue of health and social distancing. The reason that people aren't going to restaurants or taking vacations or going to the theater all has to do with social distancing and the progress of the pandemic. So I'm actually rather skeptical that policymakers can do anything outside of the realm of pure income maintenance. But let's emphasize how important that is, because we have a very large number of people who, without income support from the government, are going to lose their apartments or lose their homes through eviction, through mortgage foreclosure. We all look back to the great financial crisis, and of all the mistakes the government made, one of the most serious back in 2008, 2009, was not stepping in and preventing mortgage foreclosures. So what is the most terrible thing that can happen to an individual or a family? And that is to lose their dwelling, lose their rental apartment or their house. So that's the direction that I would push policymakers. Have one track of trying to develop the vaccine and deal with the health issues, and the other track to try to develop the most efficient types of income support that help poor people without needlessly wasting money on rich people.
So if I can, great. Of course, for many of the emerging economies and low-income countries, this is very difficult because the fiscal space is very limited and debts are already quite high. Many countries started this crisis with elevated debt levels. So I want to ask Laura about this because I do think that there will be increased debt vulnerabilities over the medium term and longer term, and this will have implications. So that really also limits the policy space for many of the countries, making prioritization very important. And I fully agree with you that addressing the health issues is going to be, of course, critical. But also a lot of concerns, especially in countries with informality, as to what would be the right policy. So Laura, what are your thoughts on, given the high, both sovereign and corporate debt levels in many of the, of course, advanced economies as well, but many of the emerging and developing economies, and how to prioritize?
So let me tell you at front that I have been very worried when developing countries have tried to copy the policies of rich countries for many reasons. One is our economic structure is very different. We have a lot of informality. So these policies to help firms to come at the expense of informality, and we have a lot of people of poor people. So in a way, simple cash transfers, sustainable, might be the way to go and not grant schemes. But mostly, I have been worried about our lack of fiscal space and our lack of capacity to spend. So as your report shows, the era of low interest rates in many emerging markets, in particular in Latin America, did not go to increase productivity, did not go to increase infrastructure, and did not go to increase human capital. So let me put the example of Costa Rica. Costa Rica, before the pandemic, we had a fiscal deficit of 7% of GDP, and this is after a tax reform. Again, just to give you a sense of the responsible fiscal management. Of course, rating agencies were lowering the view on Costa Rica because there was no credibility to reform. I guess Costa Rica is an example of the late Alesina case, a reform with no credibility. And in Latin America, we want to be Keynesian in bad times, we want to spend, but we don't do our work in the good times. To be Keynesian, you have to save in good times to be able to spend in bad times. So every time we get a bad time, we have no fiscal space, but also we have very little capacity to spend. The fact that the era of low interest rates didn't go to increase productivity, investment, or human capital shows that it went to consumption. It went to private consumption and it went to public consumption. And I do worry that now there are all these big schemes that are giving a lot of money to emerging markets, not worried about this capacity to spend. So I saw in Financial Times, there are already examples of money not going to where it has to go. Again, I'm going to poke in my own country, not to feel anyone bad. In Costa Rica, there is corruption in medical devices. There has been buying a lot of masks and so on and so forth, that you don't find the masks, or it was not given to the right person. The aid is not going to the right people. It's just a lot of money that is being asked to be spent very quickly without a lot of accountability and transparency. So again, a call for transparency and accountability. And I think sometimes we have this view that any spending is better than no spending. And I would remind you that corruption delegitimizes democracies, delegitimizes the social pact that we have. I pay taxes because I get something. Bolsonaro and López Obrador in Latin America arrived because of the corruption of the previous governments. So it's not without any consequence when we allow governments to spend without paying attention. So again, we need to be careful how this money is being spent. And then the solution, what do we do about it? There's now this call, let's not pay or moratorium. It's interesting that the countries in emerging markets that have put a lot of effort to create markets and financial development were not very happy with this proposal. There are actually very few takers because, again, they worry about the credibility and implications. And we also have the case of Argentina that every, 5 years or 10 years defaults, and we don't see this magic development that happens in Argentina. I have always thought that development is, you have to learn how to organize yourselves in the good times and the bad times. And somehow these debt reliefs don't seem to bring that. A lot of that relief, what it brought was fiscal space for countries to borrow from China, that has also a lot of set of implications. But the other problem is how we deal with these debt problems. At least in the 80s in Latin America, what we did is we said, we don't hire and we don't increase wages. Development needs good people in government. And this is not a statement of a big government or a small government. It just needs good people in government. And so what we did in Latin America is the good people left. And so when I came to government, we had very few engineers. We had few people who knew statistics because we were not paying them. And I think this is going to happen again. I don't see a lot of willingness to reform and reallocate because we're in a pandemic and everyone is afraid of the tough decisions. But there are things that need to be adjusted. And it was mentioned, healthcare in the US needs to adjust. Education in the US needs to adjust. In emerging markets, we need to reallocate and a lot of things need to be done. But I think the urgency of the short run is going to get in the way of these reforms.
I think that's unfortunately the case. Nick, any thoughts what policymakers should be thinking about?
I mean, I'll build off two comments, one from Bob, one from Laura. On Bob, there's been a big debate in the US about US versus Europe about how we should subsidize people. So just to be clear, I'm totally aligned with Bob. We've asked people to stop work. We need to give them an income. We can't leave them to starve. So then the question is how you do it. And one model is through the firm. You subsidize the firm. You keep giving the firm cash to hire people, but they basically don't work. And the other model is you send them checks directly and you bypass the firm. Broadly speaking, the latter is a lot better because the problem with the former is it stops reallocation. So we know there's a massive amount of restructuring that needs to happen. It's like off the scale compared to before. You know, honestly, the airline sector is probably permanently 30–40% down. After 9/11, it took 3 years to come back. It's going to be, 10 years. There's whole sectors that are just, even once we have a vaccine, there's plenty of survey evidence. I've been running surveys on this. People are very nervous about getting into crowded lifts and elevators and various things. So I think if possible, if it's, fiscally feasible, you're better off cutting checks to individuals than subsidizing firms, because a lot of the firms that need subsidies need to basically, unfortunately, go out bankrupt. We go out of business. We need some creative destruction. It's painful. At least we don't want people to starve in the process. But that's a policy debate, and there's trade-offs. The other issue, as Laura said, is it's totally not obvious to me that developing countries should be copying the policies in developed countries. And I completely take on board the comments in the report and that she said on government capacity, and also the idea that if you think of what happened in the 1918–1919 flu pandemic, the US was at a lower level of development. And so if you think of kind of concave utility, as you get wealthier, each extra dollar is worth less and less. So when you're poor, the cost of an economic shutdown is pretty severe versus the health benefits. When you're rich, it's less obvious. And so in 1918, 1919, we didn't, completely shut the economy down. It's really not obvious to me that in poor countries, you want to be going for a big shutdown, because plan B that Sweden's doing is, just develop herd immunity. And it may be in a lot of developing countries without the government's capacity to subsidize people, a shutdown is particularly painful, and the loss of income is particularly challenging for them. And these populations are younger, so I'm skeptical on it. There's a debate in the US as it is about whether he should have had a shutdown. It seems far less obvious to me in particularly poorer countries we want this.
Yes, I mean, for many of the countries that we work in, it's very difficult, as you said, to shut down. They try to adjust to COVID and have practices and protocols to deal with COVID, because as you will hear from many, the choice becomes, dying from hunger versus dying from COVID, unfortunately. So a lot of the the fiscal space is not there. And one question, though, from the discussion just now, there's a big difference between what the US is doing versus what Europe is doing in terms of firm support. One is more keeping workers in place and with reduced wages and subsidies and so on. And the other one is more through unemployment benefits. And perhaps that's the relocation you're talking about, Nick. Some of the concerns with this approach is, given that we don't know what type of world we will be living in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year from now, it has implications on human capital, right? It has implications in terms of whether you are out of the workforce or whether you work with reduced hours. So it would be great to hear from each of you as to this important issue of keeping the lights on and keeping the firms going versus trying to reallocate and move to new sectors. Would be really good to hear from you as to how you see those trends. How does one have a more educated understanding of those trends going forward, and how do you then adjust policies based on those trends? So maybe if I can start with you, Bob, and then go to Nick.
And listening to Nick on the contrast between the U.S. and Europe, we do have some examples of European policies being introduced in the United States. Most notably, the airline industry received a huge bailout on the condition that it retain employment, and that runs out on October 1st. And the airlines have announced massive permanent job losses. The fact that the money ran out is something that is relevant to all countries, even in Europe, where the policies have been very generous in giving firms the funds they need to retain workers. Those policies have termination dates in most cases. They're not going to last forever. And we know that the pandemic is going to go on for some substantial amount of time. Even when the vaccine is developed, one or more vaccines, it will take a substantial amount of time to go through the organizational task of bringing that vaccine to people and getting them vaccinated in the hundreds of millions and even billions of people that will be necessary to be treated. So we're going to, I think, run out of room for the European solution because they just won't have enough money to keep it going. So for the medium term, looking out for a year or two, we may find that the ability of governments to sustain their kind of income support begins to dwindle away as they face fiscal deficits and what for the less developed countries you call fiscal space. The United States is somewhat unique in that, along with Japan and a few other countries, it can print its own currency, and the rest of the world is happy to hold the debts that are issued, so that the debt ratio is not a constraint in the United States, as it has proven not to be in Japan, whereas in some other parts of the developed world and in almost all of the underdeveloped or emerging world, we have these very difficult constraints that mean that policymakers may have a laundry list of things they'd like to do, but they can't afford to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a very important area of work for us at the bank. We work very closely with the IMF as well in terms of debt transparency, debt sustainability, and of course, COVID makes it very difficult when you have advanced economies spending 20% of GDP doing whatever it takes. Of course, many of the countries that we work in don't have that capacity. The stimulus packages are 3 to 5% maximum. And what worries me is some of the support is in the context of hiding things in SOE balance sheets or banks' balance sheets and taking, the types of measures that are used, which may imply much bigger problems going forward. We have questions from the audience, so we have about 20 minutes left. So I'm going to actually go to those because it's in line with some of the earlier discussion we had. And I'm going to start again with you, Bob, about digital technologies and also ask Laura and Nick as well, in terms of the impact of new revolutionary digital technologies. There was quite a bit of work earlier, the J-curve idea, right, that this does not show up in the productivity data because it requires decades of investment, to complementary investment to be incorporated in production processes. With COVID, we have seen acceleration of some of these technologies. So it would be really good to hear from each of you as to what do you see as the role of these technologies in terms of improving productivity.
Well, in my work, what I find most remarkable are two related questions. And this, with apologies to your theme of emerging markets, these are issues that have come up in the developed countries and of course spill over in their implications to the emerging markets. One puzzle is why the United States had a profound productivity revival in the late 90s and early 2000s that only lasted for 8 to 10 years, and why productivity growth in the United States has now slowed down for a full decade to be lower than 1% per year, something that has never occurred before in US history. The related second question is, why did productivity growth in Europe and Japan continue to slow down throughout the period when the US was doing well? Why did the digital revolution of available equipment and technologies that were accessible to everyone not occur in Europe in the same way that it did in the US? And the answer that we get is essentially a restatement of a puzzle, because we looked at Europe to ask why did Was it because they didn't invest enough in IT, or the IT just didn't have the same benefits? And about 80% of the difference between the US and Europe was that the IT in Europe just did not have the same payoff and the same benefits. So this leads to a lot of questions at the level of micro industries, the kind of thing that Nick is such an expert about. Looking forward now, we have a mini revolution going on with a lot of electronic equipment being purchased by people to work in their homes. And you have what amounts to a lot of capital obsolescence, taking the form of office buildings and the equipment inside the office buildings that is now being replaced by equipment at home. I would take Nick's result as the first I've heard, that the effect of this shift to home on TFP and on labor productivity has been negative, even though I would have thought that with the elimination of commuting and the wasted time in commuting, that if anything, individual productivity would go up, thinking of it in the context of the total 24-hour day. More of your time is productive if you're not having to travel back and forth to work. So those are just a few thoughts on the way technology is impacting the current situation.
Over to you, Nick, and then I'll go to Laura.
Thanks. So super interesting. A great question. In fact, on Bob's, I'd be interested to hear what Laura said on Bob's puzzles. I agree. I'll make two comments. One on, weirdly enough, I have this different research agenda on working from home. I worked on working from home like 10, 15 years ago, and it was so quiet. No one was honestly that interested in working from home. And suddenly, as of March this year, my phone just didn't stop ringing. So I must have spoken to about 100 firms by now. I know I had something in the World Bank, but it's just insane how. So I tell you a couple of things on that. They're kind of interesting. It kind of linked a bit to what Bob said. One is, you're right that there's been this long puzzle about why we didn't use technology. We have now at least used technology to enable us to work from home. So something like 40 to 50% of Americans are working from home full time. In developing countries, it's far lower. The World Bank, I've seen some great research from you on this, but that's been enabled by technology. So if you go through the 5 things we need internet, we need broadband, we need cheap laptops, we need video calls, and we really need like cloud, as in Dropbox. And the last 2 of them, the most recent, but I mean, Skype was around from Skype came out in 2003, Dropbox 2010. So basically for the last 10 years, we've been able to do this. We haven't. Suddenly it's been like critical. So it's true that technology didn't increase productivity before, but you could flip it around and say, my God, if we hadn't had the ability to work from home now, it would be absolutely disastrous. We'd either have to all go back to work and get infected, or would have a complete collapse in productivity. So that's one thing. The other issue that's, I want to say something positive, we can fit it into the 1 hour, which is post-pandemic, I think working from home would be really great. So just to give you a lay of the landscape, before pandemic, basically hardly anyone worked from home. So in the US, which is one of the most advanced countries, only 5% of working days were working from home. It's very rare. During the pandemic, it's 40%, but that 40% is people that are doing it full time. And that's not great either. So when you talk to firms, they're really bemoaning the fact you can't meet individually and have creative time in the office. Post-pandemic, it looks like it will go back down to something like 20% of working days. But that will be from the 40% of us that can work from home, doing it every other day. And that, I think, will be fantastic. So coming to Bob's, plus, I think post-pandemic is the one positive side of it could be we now work from home. Everyone on this call, we could all work from home 2 days a week. Probably most people listening could work from home 2 days a week. And that would be great. You're in their office Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Everyone's in the office Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or you have an on-off week schedule. All your group meetings and conferences and client events are there. Tuesday, Thursday, you're at home. And that would increase, I think, overall productivity. So that is an upside. We're not there yet. The problem is right now we're at home full time, and that's not great. That's probably no better than being in the office full time. We want some kind of mixed mode.
Right. I mean, some of that research does show that there's a big difference in terms of working from home in advanced economies versus developing countries. So, Laura, over to you.
Yeah, let me just remind you that we also have our kids at home, homeschooling. And so at that time that the time that we were supposed losing in commuting. And today I came to the office, and let me remind you, it was a blessing, that the moment you had for yourself. But I think this is something to keep in mind. It's not the same when you chose to stay and work from home one day and you were by yourself, that now you have to deal with 3 meals and also helping kids with the homework, and everyone is fighting for the Wi-Fi. I just don't think this is in many ways what we were thinking in working from home. And I have one kid. I always think about Nick, that I know has 4. And as I said, today I needed to leave the house. But for Latin America, I have this interesting paper with Marcela Slava and Oscar Becerra from Colombia. Colombia in many ways represents Latin America in the fact that it has a very high informal sector. This is true of developing countries. So we're talking that informality in emerging markets can be close to 70%. It's a little bit more in sub-Saharan Africa. We also have data on the work that was before done from home, and it was less than 10%. This has to do with the fact that the structure of the economy is still tilted towards agriculture, and that cannot be work done from home, and manufacturing. But even services that, again, there's a little bit of a composition. Wi-Fi doesn't work. It's interesting because in many emerging markets, everyone has a cell phone. Broadband doesn't work. We don't have enough speed. And so it's very hard to do a conference. I have been doing them in Costa Rica. Every time we have a thunderstorm, everything goes off and you don't see anyone. So it's not that the phone saves you. There's also the informality related to not paying taxes. And that's also why you don't want to do things online. You don't want to pay online. Like it's related to many things. And this correlates with the fact that the pandemic has been devastating to these economies. If you see the numbers that are coming out from India, Colombia, Latin America, Brazil, and even Turkey, again, although Turkey has a little bit less informality, 10, 20% reductions in output. Again, this just makes it hard. And as I mentioned, we don't have right now the capacity to do the investments that are needed. So the adjustment is going to be very difficult. Also, there are some of us that need the energy of people. I just don't see how we're going to be able to sustain innovation, ideas, and also kids in school if this goes for 1 year. Like the energy is needed to keep people motivated.
So on that one, this also comes from the audience as well, the implication in terms of human capital, because obviously there can be potentially long-term damage to productivity because of loss in schooling, loss in human capital. So what are your thoughts on this? Are you worried that there would be long-term damage to productivity? What can be done about this? Or possible positive outcomes on productivity? Are there any? So let's start with you, Laura, and then I'll go to Nick and Bob.
So in Latin America in the 80s, when we had the debt crisis, one thing we know is we had a lost generation. People dropped out of high school. And so when I was in government, I was dealing with 40 and 50-year-old people that had no high school titles. And they become very hard to hire, especially because we will see a part of the economy that will become more digital, more IT. Like that I don't think it's going to be what we have now, but for sure it's not going to be what we had before. There is going to be a more movement to IT. So I do worry about that. I worry about in all the countries and even in the US, the kids that had no Wi-Fi, and so they cannot be found. I worry about keeping kids engaged a whole year online, and so they're gonna drop out. I worry about the fact that we're creating a construction and boom, housing boom, very low interest rates. That's going to, again, move the economy towards more capital. Capital is cheap in a world that finishing high school becomes very difficult. So that also is going to move even more people to drop out. And again, at least in the countries I know, I just don't see this as being the number one concern. I just don't see, again, in my country, to poke on a country I don't see the government extremely worried about the fact that we're going to have a lot of kids dropping out of high school. And this is going to have serious consequences that are not easy to solve. As I said, I was dealing with the folks of the 80s, And there are very little things you can do in terms of retraining when it takes that long, and they just didn't finish high school or in many cases even school.
Yeah, and that will reopen a much bigger divide between those that can. And yeah, Bob, Nick, any thoughts on you on human capital?
I'd like to go from the issue of people dropping out of high school to the rather remarkable fact that in the United States, 40% of new college graduates cannot find jobs that require a college education. And this suggests that we may be putting too many people through college, or we may need to somehow create more jobs that require a college education. We have a lot of college graduates that are working in Starbucks and working at jobs that have very routine skill requirements. So I'm somewhat skeptical that more people dropping out of college or more people dropping out of high school is going to have tremendous long-run effects on productivity. That doesn't mean we should encourage it. It's just that means that we should not become hysterical about a short-run loss of educational.
That's a very interesting point, because this is an agenda, jobs and economic transformation, that's really critical in our work as well, because in many of the emerging market countries as well, you see that many college graduates don't get jobs. So the question about how to have more and better jobs is really a critical one. Nick, any thoughts on this?
So just one comment.
Yeah.
At least in the countries I know, if I have an engineer or someone with anything math or anything science, they had a guaranteed job. So I agree, there's many college kids that cannot find jobs, but that doesn't necessarily mean they should drop out of high school and college. It may be that we just need to make sure people are studying things that are needed. I do know, and again, in Latin America happens, there's a factory of titles. There's a lot of private and public schools that just throw titles, and they have no accountability in trying to teach kids things that they need. But I just don't see people who don't know how to read and write, and that's what's going to happen when they drop out of school and high school, or that they don't have critical thinking, being able to have a good life and later on.
Yeah, agreed. And also in terms of being able to use digital technology, you need some basic education. This is a big concern for us as well in terms of consumer literacy, and because it is subject to abuse. Nick, what are your thoughts?
Laura said it perfectly. I defer to her expertise. I'm totally aligned with Laura, so I will say no more.
Okay, so last question to each of us. Are there any reasons to be optimistic? What type of good things in the context of productivity can come out of the pandemic?
I'm happy to go first. There are kind of two optimistic things. One, I mentioned earlier, just working from home. Just from talking, it is true, by the way, in the US, something like 40% of people can and currently are working from home. The piece I'm blanking on, it came from the World Bank I saw recently, showing, like on Laura's number, it was more like 10% in developing countries, partly because of industrial structure, as she mentioned. There are just less jobs that can do it, and partly just because of facilities. So, but at least in developed countries and to less extent in developing countries, working from home is a big upside, and it's not going to be full time. It's going to be 2-3 days a week. The other issue I think is helpful is to reverse something that has been raised as a huge concern, which is over urbanization. So again, I mean, Bob briefly mentioned it earlier about all this, excess capacity in office blocks. It's very clear that the places that are getting annihilated are skyscrapers. I mean, if you want to have, a completely useless piece of, real estate, it is a skyscraper in Manhattan or Salesforce Tower in San Francisco. Just to explain why, there are two huge problems. So what's same in Mumbai or Shanghai, you're going to get to the front door on mass transit, which requires, close proximity. And even at the front door, you get to get up to floor 30, which requires using the elevator or the lift, depending on, you know, what you call it, where you come from. So these things in New York, for example, occupancy rates of these skyscrapers is like 10, 15%. I don't see in surveys so I ran a survey of 2,500 Americans aged 20 to 64, you know, a couple of months ago. And they expressed, one of the questions was on post-pandemic, what would you feel comfortable with? 77% of people said they'd still feel uncomfortable about getting in a packed elevator or subway train. I think we've all watched way too many of those horrible sneeze videos of like particles flying everywhere to ever get into, you know. So I actually think on a positive note, we will push back on cities and push up on suburbs and rural areas. So, you know, again, this, you know, much like all of us, we travel a lot. This is true as much, you know, the urbanization, the urban premium is in India as it is in China, as it is, you know, in Latin America and Europe. I think that's going to reverse 10, 20 years. So cities were at their low point in 1980. They hit that, we know. I remember going to New York, by the way, in 1980 with my parents as a kid. And there were two armed guards with guns at the door to the McDonald's on Times Square, which is now like really expensive. And back then it was so, there was not one, but two. The fact they thought they needed two people with guns at the, you know, so in 1980 was like cities controlled by crack gangs and loads of crime to 2019. They're so expensive in Silicon Valley. There's a whole affordability crisis. So I think it's going to push back. And I think that's actually good. It's less regional inequality and more balanced growth.
Let me add to
That will
that.
have huge implications on commercial real estate, though.
Yes, so just to be
And
clear.
has implications on the financial sector.
Yeah,
Sorry.
just so I was talking to a Brazilian commercial real estate company, one in Singapore, one in Switzerland, one in the US. So in the US, where I have the best data, the net demand for commercial real estate is about flat because working from home in the recession is reducing demand, but space per person is going up, which is increasing demand. But there's a massive move out of skyscrapers into industrial parks and like, you know, places that basically you can drive to and are only 2 or 3 stories. So you have to use the stairs. And that's true around the world. The Brazilian company I was talking to is bemoaning no one's in their high rises. And they're trying to, things like old gyms that go bankrupt, they're perfect for offices. They have parking and they're 1 story.
Just to add one thought to this obsolescence, we have a tremendous shift going on in residential real estate markets now, with vast oversupply of condominiums downtown and a tremendous burst of demand for suburban houses. This is partly people wanting to move to bigger suburban houses from smaller suburban houses because they need room for all the Wi-Fi for their children as well as themselves to work at home. But about the emerging markets, let's not just say that urbanization will be reversed in the sense of going back to agriculture. Urbanization will be reversed in the direction of suburban office parks, as Nick said. But we're not all going to go back to an agricultural economy.
I clearly don't have my to-do list of things after pandemic that matches Nick's surveys, because we have concerts and we're going to travel the world and we so want to go back to New York City. I do like the energy. I do agree that there are going to be changes, but many centuries of diseases and pandemics have not killed the city. And I think we see at universities, kids wanted to come back. Kids wanted to come back to the university because of this agglomeration of being next to each other. So there might be a transition, but I just don't see the end of the city. Good things for the companies and firms that can, there has been a lot of experimentation. I have seen, in particular in universities, there has been a lot of testing and trying and see what it works. And I think that experimenting mentality might stay and may have positive effects. The other is places that have had good public-private alliances. I have seen very positive cooperations. And Massachusetts is a state where I have seen the government talking to businesses and also to the scientific community here that is great and trying to find solutions. And so my hope is that many would see that when you have a good government that talks to businesses and to scientists, good things can come about. So those are positive spins to this world. And I do hope to go back to my concert and the US Open and a Lakers game against the Celtics live.
I hope that will be soon, Laura. And this was a great discussion. We are almost over in terms of our time. I really appreciate the discussion and the thoughts you have brought in and the insights. This will be recorded and made available if anyone wants to listen to it again. But I think there are lots of issues. This was great to discuss some different perspectives and in terms of what we should be looking at going forward. And you know, Bob, you mentioned the issue of we're not going to agricultural rural economy, but for many of the countries we work in, increasing productivity in the agriculture sector is a key objective, and that doesn't necessarily mean everyone going back to agriculture, but really making sure that we innovate. And we had a good product come out, harvesting prosperity. This was really trying to look at how we can learn from other countries and developed countries and increase agricultural productivity in low-income economies. So that clearly remains as a key work area for us and a lot of the issues that we discussed today. Thank you so much for this discussion, and you're also always great support to us in our research, our policy work. So thank you so much for this and your contributions to us. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, it's great. I love listening to Laura
Thank
and
you.
Bob as well. Thanks very much, Jayla.
Thanks.
you.
This was
Bye-bye.
great. Thanks, ciao.
Bye-bye.